We're still in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. The system is unstable, the instability is growing. The next crisis will be bigger. People look at it and say, hey, get me out of here, get me into hard assets, silver, gold. When I see people with 401ks, 100% in the stock market, I just say, this is an accident waiting to happen. This is actually the first interview of the book tour.
Don't forget to join us for our next live stream this Sunday night, July 21st at 9 p.m. Eastern. We'll go over current events, gold and silver news, and our interview with Jim Rickards. Once again, join us for our next live stream coming up this Sunday night, July 21st, 9 p.m. See you then. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira. Once again, if you have not already done so, or you are new to this channel, please do subscribe, click on the bell to be notified of new updates, and do give us a thumbs up if you like what we do. We are joined on SBTV today by James Rickards, author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Currency Wars, The Death of Money, and The Road to Ruin. He also has contributed as an advisor on capital markets to the U.S. intelligence community and at the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. And we are delighted to have James here today as our guest. Good day, James Rickards, and welcome to SBTV. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you, Patrick. Great to be with you.
Great, we're glad you're on. We've been trying to get you for a while, and we're absolutely thrilled that you're here. We know you've been busy writing your book, so that's what we'll go ahead and talk about.
Great.
The coming crisis. Jim, your latest book, Aftermath, which is released this year, is the 4th volume of a quartet of your previous works, namely Currency Wars, The Death of Money, and The Road to Ruin. And you've mentioned in Aftermath that these 4 books somewhat resemble the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of the book of Revelation. Can you share with us how are they alike and how it relates to the recent past and perhaps not too distant future of the international monetary system?
Sure, I'd be glad to. You know, it's a loose metaphor, but you're right. It's called the International Monetary Quartet. 4 books: Currency Wars, The Death of Money, The Road to Ruin, and now Aftermath. And a lot of people have heard of the 4 horsemen of the book of Revelation. And an interesting question is if you ask people to name them, and they get through, they say, well, death and war, they get through that pretty quickly, but then they can't get the other 2. They're like plague or disease or whatever. And actually, one of them doesn't have a name. It's the black horse, the 3rd horseman. But the message from Scripture really talks. You could say it's famine or a plague of insects. It's basically high prices of food, but you could also say inflation. That's another interpretation. So it lends itself to the economy. And then the 4th, actually the first in order in terms of the Scripture is the white horse, and that's actually scholars can't agree on the translation from ancient Greek. So it sometimes is victory, sometimes is conquest. But I use the word aftermath because it sort of captures both ideas. But the title, people say, what does aftermath mean? What aftermath of what? And there are 2 answers to that, and they both apply. The first one is we're still in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. I know we've been in an expansion, technically an economic expansion, since July of 2009. We just passed the 10-year mark. We're now in the 121st month of an expansion, the longest expansion in U.S. history, but it's also the weakest expansion in U.S. history, and that's the point. Yeah, we've been growing, but we've been growing a little over 2% for 10 years, whereas if you go back to 1980 and look at all the expansions, the average is a little bit over 3%. And you say, well, gee, 2%, 3% doesn't sound like a big difference. It's a huge difference given the size of the economy. You take that difference and compound it over 10 years, or certainly a longer period. You're talking about trillions of dollars of lost output. Some estimates are $4 to $5 trillion. Imagine somebody going into the Oval Office and handing the president a check for $5 trillion and say, Mr. President, here, you can use this any way you like, but education, infrastructure, defense, benefits, whatever you like. That's a lot of money, right? So that's how much we've lost in this expansion relative to past expansions. I liken it more to a depression. Depression does not mean continuous decline. It does mean growth below trend. persistent growth below trend. No, it's depressed growth. And that's what we're in. So in that sense, because we have not normalized growth, we're still in the aftermath of the last financial panic. But I also take the story forward, look at the possibility of the next financial panic, and that's a lot of what the book is about, pointing to things that you can see today that tell you the system is unstable, the instability is growing. I'm not saying there'll be a financial crash tomorrow, although perhaps we shouldn't be surprised if there is. But whether it's a year from now or 2 years from now, sooner than later, these things do happen on a regular basis. That's going to happen. What will the aftermath of that be like? And there I make the point that very different from the last crisis. The next crisis will be bigger. The central banks won't be the ones bailing you out. Someone's going to have to bail out the central banks. And it could be more ruinous, more wealth destruction, and a different world. Now, I also say we're not helpless. There are things you can do today to prepare for this, and I talk about it in the book. So aftermath refers to the slow growth aftermath of the last financial panic and the likely aftermath of the next one.
Yes, in aftermath, it does look into what will come after the next economic crisis. But can you expand a bit and help us understand how big of a crisis we are expecting ahead, and what were the warning signs that convinced you that such a crisis is absolutely coming?
Sure. Well, first of all, in terms of the scale, and I make this point, I made this all the way back in 2000, made this point all the way back in 2011 in my first book, Currency Wars. Economists, when I say economists, I'm talking about mainstream economists, PhDs, policymakers at the Fed, scholars, people at Harvard University, MIT, collectively the economic brain trust, if you will, have got the modeling completely wrong. They take the view that the economy is an equilibrium system. It's self-correcting to some extent, but if it gets a little bit out of sync because of one extreme or another, a financial bubble, over leverage, et cetera, that's unfortunate, but you can push it back to equilibrium. So it's an equilibrium system. If it gets a little out of whack, a little bit of use policy to get it back to equilibrium. That model does not correspond to reality. It is not how things work. In fact, the economy is a complex, dynamic system. And once you get into complexity theory, and it's a very powerful branch of physics. It's been used in. It's also a branch of applied mathematics. It's been used successfully in many phenomena, a lot of natural phenomena. Forest fires, earthquakes, climate, and then other man-made phenomena. You can apply it to a lot of things. It has not been widely applied to economics. It should be, because the economy is a complex system, and I've looked at that in all of my books. But it hasn't been because either people don't want to, economists or people in markets, Wall Street analysts, et cetera, either they don't want to take the time to understand it, or if they do understand it, they find it's not in their best interest to talk about because, they like this warm, fuzzy approach. Hey, just buy stocks, keep buying stocks. The stock market goes up and up. That's good for Wall Street. It's not necessarily good for investors in the long run. Yeah, short run, you get some gains, but long run, it's a little bit unstable. But the minute you understand complexity, the first thing you learn is that, is that the worst thing that can happen in a system, in other words, the worst kind of financial panic or crash, is a function of scale. The bigger the system, the worse the potential collapse. That much seems obvious, but it's an exponential function or a superlinear function. What that means is that if you double the system, double the scale of the system, you don't double the risk. You increase it by 5 or 10 times. And I had this debate with the CEO and board of directors of Morgan Stanley. I did a private briefing for them. And I talk about this in chapter 8 of the book, kind of tell the story of this briefing. And they were given, obviously a very smart group. They're running one of the biggest banks in the world. And they gave me a lot of pushback. They said, well, Jim, don't you know, our capital is up, our positions are down, we're taking less risk, fewer derivatives, more liquidity, subject to the Volcker rule, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, yes, that's all true. The bank individually is safer than it was in 2008. But you're part of a system. You're part of a bigger system. And the system as a whole is much more vulnerable and much more risky. And if that system collapse begins, you're going to go down with it. In other words, the fact that your individual bank is safer doesn't doesn't deal with the fact that the system is riskier. And I look at systemic collapse, and that's where all the banks just fall like dominoes. And so, look, they're directors, their board of directors, the CEO, they have to take care of their bank. But I was pointing out to them that they're part of something bigger, and it's the stability of the bigger system that one needs to worry about. All that happened in 2008, 2009, the risk was private, so Bear Stearns had failed, Fannie Mae failed, Freddie Mac failed, Lehman failed, and they were all going to collapse like dominoes in a matter of days. In late September 2008, Morgan Stanley was days away from collapse. Goldman would have been right behind it, then Citi, et cetera. They all would have fallen. Well, the Federal Reserve stepped in and truncated that dynamic. Bernanke and Henry Paulson just kind of waved their hands and said, look, we're guaranteeing all money market funds. We're guaranteeing all bank deposits regardless of size. We're going to backstop the European Central Bank with trillions of dollars of currency swaps. The problem in Europe is they were short of dollars. European banks were all failing also. They were short of dollars. They turned to the central bank. Well, the European Central Bank doesn't print dollars. It prints euros. But they needed dollars. So what they did is the ECB printed up a bunch of euros, the Fed printed up a bunch of dollars, and they did a currency swap, and the Fed gave the European Central Bank all those dollars to bail out their own banks. By the way, that was not disclosed at the time. This was all behind the curtain. Came out years later after Dodd-Frank. But my point being, the central banks bailed out bailed out Wall Street and bailed out the private banks. But they didn't change anything. The debt didn't go away. It just moved upstairs. It moved from the balance sheet of the private banks to the balance sheet of the central banks. And it's still there. The Fed has not normalized the size of its balance sheet. They have not reversed quantitative easing. They have not normalized interest rates. Yeah, they raised them somewhat and brought the balance sheet down a little bit, not nearly enough to deal with a new crisis or even a new recession. So the question is, in the next crisis, who's going to bail out the central banks? And there's no one bigger than a central bank except the IMF. They have the only clean balance sheet. So now you're into world money, world control. It's a whole different scenario. And again, I talked about this in the book.
Chapter 8, interesting. Another interesting chapter that you wrote was where you discussed Godzilla and the size of a blue whale. You mentioned that no creature larger than a blue whale can exist on Earth due to something called the terminal unit. Can you share with us why you wrote about Godzilla and what the terminal unit has to do with our financial system today?
Sure. The terminal unit comes out of advanced physics and complexity theory. It's done at places like the Los Alamos Institute in New Mexico, the Santa Fe Institute, I meant to say, the Los Alamos National Laboratory and the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, and other institutes. I've lectured on the financial aspects of complexity theory at a number of those institutions, been able to meet the top physicists in the world who deal in this. My problem is that the physicists get it, the economists don't. But this comes out of the work of Jeffrey West, who wrote a very good book called Scale that deals with this at an advanced level. But here's the point. So kind of using Godzilla as an example, Godzilla is a fictional movie creature I first saw in the 1950s in the black and white film version. But in the movie, the first movie, Godzilla was about 150 feet tall. I think there's another summer release. Godzilla keeps getting bigger. Now he's 300 feet tall. But the question is, why or can a creature like that exist in the real world? Fictional, yeah, Hollywood special effects, no problem. But can it exist in the real world? It turns out it cannot. The tallest creature ever, as far as we know, and we have a pretty good record, is the giraffe. It's 20 feet tall. The largest creature is a blue whale. It's about 100 feet long. But why can't you have a 200-foot whale or a 50-foot giraffe? Well, the answer in the case of height, in the case of the giraffe, you're standing on legs, or you're standing on basically legs, 2 legs or 4 legs or whatever, which have bones that hold you up. Well, how much pressure can a bone bear? Or if you want to talk about architecture, a steel beam or any support, a wooden beam, any support structure. Well, that is a function of the cross section. It's not, the height doesn't really matter that much, but the cross section does. It's the square of the area of the cross section. But how much, when you increase the size of a creature, how much does the weight go up? Well, that's a cubic measurement because you got height, but you also got width and breadth. So if your weight is increasing by a cubic function and your strength is increasing by a square function, obviously the weight is going to go faster than the support, and the creature will fall of its own weight. That's why buildings sometimes collapse and creatures can't be above a certain size. And that's just math. I mean, it's human nature. It's math. Galileo figured it out. Physicists understand it today. It's not because there's something bad about it. It's just because it can't happen. It can't support its own weight. When it comes to the terminal unit, so how much, humans are on average, 5 feet 9 inches tall. Some taller, some shorter, but that's kind of the middle of the road. A blue whale is 100 feet long. But we both have the same size blood cells. The blood cell of a human is the same size as the blood cell of a blue whale. That's the terminal unit. In other words, no matter how big the creature is, the heart's got to pump, the blood's got to go through arteries and capillaries and et cetera, and get to the tissue, because it has to supply oxygen to the tissue everywhere in the body. And if it doesn't, the tissue dies and the creature dies. And the point is, as the creature gets bigger, the amount of energy that the heart has to use is greater than the amount of energy being delivered to the tissue, and the creature dies because it can't get enough energy to do its job. So that's a limit. That's why the blue whale's 100 feet long, and nothing ever in biology has ever been longer in terms of creatures in the sea. And that's different because the water supports the weight. It's not about the weight, it's about the size. So my point is, once you can identify the terminal unit in any structure, it doesn't have to be a living creature, it can be an abstract structure or a building. What about the financial system? What about the banks? What about JP Morgan? Is there a terminal unit, abstractly in finance? Well, yeah, it would be the individual customer. You want a loan, you got a credit card, you make a deposit in the bank or an individual company. That terminal unit doesn't change, whether it's a small local bank, a mid-sized regional bank, or the biggest bank in the world. The terminal unit is the same. So what is the limit on the size of the institution? Again, analogizing to Godzilla or a human being or a giraffe or a blue whale, they all have limits. In theory, there's a limit on financial institutions as well. And if they get too big, they collapse of their own weight, the same way a 50-foot giraffe would collapse or a real-life Godzilla would collapse. Well, why don't banks collapse? Well, the answer is they do. But the Federal Reserve puts up what I call a scaffold. In other words, in theory, you could have a creature the size of Godzilla in the real world. It could not support its own weight. But if you put a scaffold around it and propped it up, in other words, it could perhaps. So the Federal Reserve and the regulators and the central banks are the scaffold. They allow these financial institutions to be bigger than they normally could be without collapsing by propping them up with, how do they do it? Guarantees, deposit insurance, off-balance sheet accounting, too big to fail. What happened in 2008 was evidence of this. Zero interest rate policy for 6 years. So what does that do? Well, if I'm a bank and my cost of funds is 0, but I can lend money at 2%, and I leverage it 10 to 1, guess what? I've got a 20% return on equity. So zero interest rate policy was taking money out of the pockets of American savers and putting it into Jamie Dimon's bonus over at JP Morgan. And that's one reason for the rise of populism. I don't want to get into politics too much. It's not my subject, but you can look at the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and say a lot of that was unresolved anger at the way the Fed had bailed out the wealthy and the banks in 2008, but hurt everyday Americans. So the point is, the banking system is dangerous because it's bigger than and too complex and too risky relative to what it could support on its own, but it gets propped up with the scaffolding of the Federal Reserve. Well, what happens when the Federal Reserve gets in trouble? What happens when people lose confidence in the dollar? What happens when money supply, people look at it and say, hey, get me out of here, get me into hard assets, silver, gold, land, fine art, natural resources, water, oil, something other than just money. That's when the scaffold itself starts to collapse and you have a catastrophe greater than 2008.
having talked about Godzilla and the terminal unit, do you agree with this view that the size of the debt does not matter to the U.S.? And how does MMT play into this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I talk about that in Aftermath. Chapter 2 goes through the history of debt in the United States. I call it a brief history. It's not most people, when you talk about debt and deficits, they just their eyes roll and they fall asleep. Maybe that's understandable, but in fact, I could argue that economically, nothing is more important than understanding how that works. And then in chapter 5, I talk about modern monetary theory. So let me just kind of briefly, make that connection. A lot of people have a view of the debt. Again, the deficit is the annual shortfall. So you have revenue, you spend money. If you spend more than you take in, you have a deficit. We had a couple surpluses in, I think, 1999, 2000. Before that was 1969. But the U.S. has been running deficits for a long, long time. We're looking at another $1 trillion deficit this year. So that's an annual concept. But the debt, the national debt, that's the total debt of all deficits in the entire history of the United States. Today, that number is around $23 trillion, if you can believe that. But that's the national debt. Now, a lot of people have a view that, George Washington becomes president, and he borrows some money, and every president borrows some money. Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, FDR, Bush 43, Obama, Trump, and somehow we got to $23 trillion, and it kept going up. That's not true. That is not what happened. Actually, George Washington had national debt before he was sworn in. When George Washington became president of the United States, the U.S. already had a national debt before we were a nation because we borrowed money to fight the Revolutionary War. And people at the time said, well, what do we do about this? We can't pay it. And they said, why don't we just default? America is very good at that. So why don't we just default, and too bad for those creditors. And it was Alexander Hamilton who said, no, here's what you do. Because if you default, you'll destroy your credit. He said, borrow new money and use the new money to pay off the old debt. And then when the new money becomes due, borrow some more and pay that off and just keep rolling it over. And Alexander Hamilton created the U.S. Treasury market, the U.S. government bond market. And he said, by borrowing money and paying off all debt, you actually improve your credit, and then you can borrow more and keep doing it. We've been doing it for, at this point, about 250 years ever since. And so that was the origin of the government bond market. But Hamilton, working with Washington, established the credit of the United States. Now, what's happened since then is not a straight line. It's a cycle. The national debt goes up and it goes down, gets paid off, then it goes up again, then it goes down again, et cetera. So it has been this cyclical phenomena. And what is the driver of the increase or the decrease? The increase is simple. It's war. When the U.S. is in a war, we borrow money to fight the war, win the war. But then in times of peace, we pay off the debt. And the reason we do that is because we know that in the future we may have to borrow again. And so you want your credit to be good. You want some dry powder. You don't shoot off all your ammunition in target practice. You save some in case you have to fight. And by the same token, you don't exhaust the borrowing power of the United States because you may need that borrowing power at some future time in an existential situation, which is what we faced, for example, in World War II and in the Civil War. So Lincoln drove up the debt to win the Civil War. FDR drove up the debt to win win World War II. And Ronald Reagan drove up the debt to win the Cold War. But at least we got something for our money. We won all those wars. But then after those wars, the debt went down again. So between, for example, after the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, 1848, the War of 1812 in particular, we increased the national debt, but Andrew Jackson paid it off. In 1836, at the end of Andrew Jackson's administration, the national debt was zero. So it did go up in Washington and Jefferson and Monroe, but it went down again in other administrations, including Andrew Jackson, who actually paid it off. When Andrew Jackson left office, he did two things in his final year. He abolished the central bank of the United States, and he paid off the debt. So we had no central bank and no debt, and that was the beginning of a great period of prosperity in American history. But other presidents had to run up. So you had this cycle, as I described. So it didn't go straight up. It went up and down and up and down, and now we're off the rails. Now we are off the rails. Now we are in uncharted territory. The cycle I described has been broken. Now the debt is going straight up. and it's in dangerous territory. Today, the debt to GDP ratio is 106%, the highest since World War II. But there's no effort underway to reduce it. So now along comes MMT, because you asked about MMT. What does MMT say? Modern monetary theory. And I explain to people, first of all, it's not modern. This goes back to the early 1900s, 1905 in particular. And it's not much of a theory because it doesn't have any empirical support, no experiments to support it. But the idea is that there's no – basically you merge the Treasury and the Fed. Now, these are legally separate entities. Treasury is part of the executive branch. The Fed's an independent agency. But you kind of merge them and you just say, look, we can spend as much as we want. And if we don't have the revenue, just issue bonds. And don't worry about the bond market because the Fed can buy the bonds and monetize it, put it on their balance sheet, wait 20 years or 30 years or whatever it is, and get their money back. What's the problem? Well, when you put it that way, it's a hard question to answer. Like, yeah, what's the problem? Legally, there's no limit on that. There are debt ceilings, but they continually get raised, and the Fed can print as much money as they want. And the modern monetary theorists point to Bernanke. Bernanke wouldn't agree with this, but what did Bernanke do? He increased the money supply by $4 trillion between 2008 and 2014 to prop up Jamie Dimon's bonus and bail out the banks. Well, the modern monetary theorists, but most of whom are progressives, the leading thinker is Professor Stephanie Kelton of Stony Brook, part of the State University of New York, who's also the advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign. She says, look, if Bernanke can increase the debt, increase the money supply $4 trillion to prop up the banks, why can't we increase it $4 trillion for the Green New Deal or Medicare for all or tuition for all or free health care, free child care, et cetera? That's when you hear these ideas coming out of whether it's Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, it's Joe Biden, the leading presidential candidates. It used to be there was an all-purpose answer. They'd come up with some big program, and I don't want to debate the program, so viewers can decide for themselves. But there used to be an all-purpose answer. You would just say, hey, we can't afford it. We can't afford it. The debt's too big. We need to get it under control. And they would sort of go back to the drawing boards. Today, they don't. You say we can't afford it. They say, yes, we can. We can afford it. Bernanke proved it. Just take the deficit as high as it needs to go. And the debt to GDP ratio, take it. You're worried about 106%? What about 120, 150? Japan is about 250. What's the problem? Well, it's a hard question to answer, but the answer is legally you could do that, but psychologically you cannot. The limit on modern monetary theory, and they don't talk about this, is actually a psychological limit. People instantaneously lose confidence in the dollar. And I talk about this a lot in my book, in Aftermath. And they say, well, yeah, if that happens, we could always, raise taxes. But the modern monetary theorists say that people cannot get out of the dollar. They cannot get out of the dollar. And the reason is that you have to pay your taxes. And the only thing the government takes in payment of taxes is dollars. They don't take gold. They don't take silver. They don't take, whatever else you're selling. They take dollars. And so what happens if you don't pay your taxes? Well, you get some nasty letters from the IRS, but eventually they'll knock on your door, put you in handcuffs, and put you in jail. And I've made this point, and it's not a very popular point, but I say, they say state money is you have to use state money whether you like it or not because it's required for taxes. And I make the point that, okay, so you're saying that the confidence in state money comes from the barrel of a gun because you will get arrested and put in jail if you don't pay your taxes. And absolutely pay your taxes. I'm not advocating anything to the contrary, but my point is people have alternatives how much taxes Mark Zuckerberg paid? He's worth about $100 billion, depending on the time of day. How much taxes he paid on that? Well, relatively little because that's all Facebook stock. So if he got his Facebook stock, his founder shares, and turned it into a $100 billion company or more, if he doesn't sell the stock, he doesn't have to pay taxes. And he has sold some, pay taxes on that, but get capital gains rates. And a lot of it he's given to foundations. So Mark Zuckerberg has largely escaped taxes on $100 billion of wealth because it's in the form of stock that he's never sold. Right. What about the everyday American? Well, you go to work, you get a W-2, They withhold taxes from your paycheck, and you pay your taxes whether you like it or not. So this whole idea that taxes are how we enforce confidence in money, it's true to some extent for everyday people, but it's not true for the super wealthy. It's not true for the elites because they have, whether it's foundations, capital gains, deferral, trust, et cetera. They have ways around it. But everyday people can, I say, you can put yourself on your own gold standard or silver standard. Just go buy some gold, buy some silver, put it in a safe place. If that goes up, you don't have to pay taxes either. You do if you sell it, but not if you hold it. And so Mark Zuckerberg holds a stock. You can hold your gold and silver, and as it goes up, you don't pay taxes on it, as I say, if you don't sell it. So I focus on the psychological barriers. You print money, increase the debt, go off the rails in terms of the history of U.S. debt, which I talk about in Chapter 2. And in Chapter 5, I point out this flaw in modern monetary theory. They say, well, you have to take dollars whether you like it or not. Not true. To some extent, yeah, you got to pay tax on your income. But beyond that, you can invest in things that you hold that are not taxed or buy other assets. Again, it doesn't have to be gold or silver. It could be land, art, natural resources, water, oil. It could be a lot of things. But the point is, it could be stocks for that matter if you don't sell them. But the point is, there are lots of legitimate ways around taxes. So this gun to the head theory doesn't work. But what is true is that people can lose confidence immediately, abandon dollars in ways you can't even imagine, legally avoid taxes in ways that you can't even imagine, and undermine this whole modern monetary theory. Increase velocity. It could increase velocity. As people get out of dollars, they buy stuff. Well, that increases velocity. Could lead to hyperinflation. The modern monetary theorist, Stephanie Kelton's answer to higher inflation is raise taxes. Oh, really? You really want to destroy the economy? Yeah, we're gonna make the dollar less valuable and raise taxes at the same time. That sounds like a winning formula. Not really. I mean, that sounds like a disastrous formula. But that's what they say. So I debate them. I'll be debating them soon at Bretton Woods. But the modern monetary theory, like you say, it doesn't hold water. It's a recipe for disaster, but people have not come up with good answers to it because of what Bernanke did, and it kind of looks Keynesian. Well, what's wrong with deficits? There's a lot wrong, and I talk about that in the book.
There have been plenty of discussions on events leading to a huge economic crash or crashes, but not as many have ventured to discuss about what happens after the crash. In Aftermath, right. You do, and you wrote that the best description of life after a financial collapse is found in The Mandibles, a 2016 novel by Lionel Shriver.
Right.
Sounded really bleak, Jim. But why did you find the post-crisis depiction of life in The Mandibles to be realistic?
Well, first of all, Lionel Shriver was very kind. She quoted me at the beginning of her book. Her book's a novel, and my books are nonfiction. But when you're looking at the future, it's kind of the same. If you write a novel about the future, you make it up. But if you write nonfiction about the future, stuff that hasn't happened yet. So in a way, it's not invented. I mean, I have models and analytics that I use, but you're still, when you're forecasting, you're talking about things that haven't happened yet. So we're covering the same ground. So she borrowed a couple things from Currency Wars, which as an author, people said to me, weren't you upset about that? I said, no, I was thrilled. You're kidding? She's an award-winning novelist. She wrote a great book. I couldn't be more thrilled that she was borrowing some of my stuff. But I kind of repaid the compliment by talking about her book at the end of Aftermath. And a lot of people, when you're out there, when you have best-selling books and you're on the lecture circuit and you're doing interviews, people like to put words in your mouth. They think they understand you, and they say, well, Jim Rickards says, sell everything and buy gold. The end of the world is coming. I've never said that. I think it's foolish to all go all into one asset. I do recommend an allocation to gold or silver, but not more than 10% of your investable assets. I think it's it's certainly a good hedge, and in a real financial catastrophe, it could perform so well that it's kind of insurance that protects. You may be losing money in other parts of your portfolio, but you'll be making it in gold and silver. So that's the insurance aspect of it. But I've never said go all in. I say 10%. And I don't believe that the end of the world is coming. At least it's above my pay grade. It's not something I'm going to be forecasting. But just because it's not the end of the world doesn't mean that things cannot change. History says they change all the time. Now, you do have some apocalyptic scenarios like Mad Max, or Cormac McCarthy has a very good novel called The Road, where it is completely desolate, and you can imagine a nuclear war scenario or something like that. That's not what I'm talking about. That's not what I foresee. That's not what Lionel Shriver was talking about. What it is that you have a financial collapse. Life goes on. People still have jobs. You still have an apartment. The police are still on the beat, but things are very, very different. Meaning you go to the grocery store and the shelves are bare, and you buy things that you don't even need. Why would you do that? Well, because maybe you can barter for them. So you might buy some steel bolts. So what are you going to do with steel bolts? Well, you might not need them, but maybe a couple of weeks later, someone wants some steel bolts, and you can barter it for some food. The police are there, but they work on bribes, so they're almost like private protection. So if you pay them off, they'll guard your house. But if not, too bad. Somebody breaks into your house, you're on your own. Water outages. She calls it dry out. The water's not clean. You have to recycle it, boil it, whatever. The point is, superficially, it looks like life goes on, but it's very substantially changed. And in some ways, it's a regression. The best case scenario would be maybe late 19th, early 20th century farm or a small town like Grover's Corners, New Hampshire, which was featured in Thornton Wilder's play Our Town. The point being, you don't have to predict the end of the world, but you can predict a changed world or a different world. And are we ready for that? And one of the ways to do that, obviously, is to have gold or silver, because that will retain its value in every state of the world. So even if you lose confidence in dollars, you're not going to lose confidence in gold and silver. So by the way, I highly recommend her book. I hope people enjoy my new book, Aftermath. And I talk about the mandibles in my book. But for those who are interested, she wrote a great book, and I highly recommend it as well. Read them both together. I think you'll have a pretty good overview of where things are going.
Will do. Jim, let's say though gold does hit 10,000 an ounce. What is Jim Rickards doing at that point? Is he buying more? Is he selling, or is he just holding?
Probably just holding. But a couple points I think are really worth mentioning. First of all, my $10,000 forecast is an intermediate term forecast. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow or later this year. It could be several years away. Two, it's not a made-up number. I didn't just pick a high number to get headlines or get attention. Nobody needs that. It's actually a very simple mathematical formula that if people lost confidence in the dollar, which I do forecast, and that could be the result of these bad modern monetary theory policy. This is all connected, by the way. You have to look at debt and deficits, modern monetary theory, psychological aspects, lost confidence, velocity. There are a lot of things in this, and I do this chapter by chapter. So, there are 8 chapters in the book, and my editor always asks me. She said, "Jim, I love these chapters. Where's the thread? Where's the thing that runs through it that makes it a book and not just a collection of articles?" And the answer is, every chapter isolates and talks about a separate vulnerability, whether it's derivatives, robo trading, the robots are in charge of the stock market. People don't understand that 95% of all the transactions on the stock market are fully automated. 80% of assets under management are in passive funds, index funds, ETFs, etc. The whole system's on autopilot. And that's fine as long as it's going up. But man, when it goes in reverse, it's going to drop with no bid, because there are no active investors left to make a market or take the other side of the trade. So we have chapters on that. But kind of just coming back to your point, Patrick, about how this all this connects. These vulnerabilities are there. They're working to erode the system. It's almost like termites in the foundation. House looks good, but it's getting closer to the point of collapse every day. So if you lose confidence in the dollar, and if you have to resort to gold to restore confidence, what's the price? And one of the key people who don't, people laugh at the gold standard, and economists dismiss it, and I have these debates all the time. And the first thing they say, they don't really understand gold, but the first thing they say is, well, there's not enough gold to support the economy. When you look at the volume of transactions and credit and commercial transactions and foreign exchange markets, et cetera, there's not enough gold to support that amount of activity. Well, that's nonsense. There's always enough gold. The question is price. And at $1,400 an ounce, no, there's not enough gold to support the current level of activity. But at $10,000 an ounce, there is. And so it's not a question of how much gold is there. It's a question of what's the price. If you peg the dollar at $1,400 per ounce of gold, or put differently, a dollar's worth 1/1400th of an ounce of gold, you would have to drastically reduce the money supply by like 80% to make that stick. Well, if you did that, you'd cause the worst depression in the history of the world. This was the mistake Winston Churchill made in 1925 when they went back to the gold standard after World War I. But if you said $10,000 an ounce with a 40% ratio of gold at the market to base money, that could work. And so that's where you get that number. It's the price that gold would have to be to avoid a deflationary depression in a return to the gold standard. Well, but if you did that, nothing happens in isolation. I explain this to gold holders. Like everyone's like, wow, I can't wait till gold gets to $10,000 an ounce. Well, be careful what you wish for, because gold at $10,000 an ounce will only preserve wealth. It doesn't really produce a big profit because the inflation would increase the price of everything else by 5 times. Now, everything else would be destroyed. So I still like my $10,000 gold, even in a hyperinflationary environment, because at least I've preserved wealth. You've made a nominal profit, big one, but you haven't made a real profit because of inflation. But everyone else is wiped out. So believe me, you want that gold insurance, you want that gold protection. And the other thing I explained to gold, I'll say gold bugs, it's kind of a little bit of a pejorative term, but I say, people say, I love gold, gold's going up, I want gold to preserve wealth. Yeah, I agree with all that. And I want a gold standard, and they bang the table. And again, I say, be careful what you wish for. You can't make any money on gold with a gold standard. A gold standard means the price of the dollar is fixed to a weight of gold. The way to make money in gold is, if you want to make money in gold, I'm not recommending this for the country, but if you want to make money in gold, you should be rooting for really bad monetary policy, people at the Fed who don't know what they're doing, excessive debt to GDP. You should be rooting for modern monetary theory, all these really bad policies and flawed policymakers. That's what you should be rooting for, because that will cause the price of gold to skyrocket. By the way, that is pretty much what we have. So get your gold now while you still can, because we've got a recipe for disaster. But if you wanted something sound, like a gold standard, the kind of thing Judy Shelton talks about, and Dr. Shelton is Donald Trump's nominee to go on the Federal Reserve Board. If you want that, and I do think it's a good idea, that's the end of profits in gold. So sort of an uneasy tension. On the one hand, gold investors want the price of gold to go up, okay, but that will mostly preserve wealth, whereas other things are going down. But if you want a gold standard to restore stability, so what you're going to get is a one-time gain, then a lock-in, and a new gold standard. And after that, you should be investing in productive things like, that might be a good time to buy stocks or technology and so forth. So there's a little bit of a, I won't say a conflict, I'll say a paradox or a conundrum between higher gold prices, which will preserve wealth, and a gold standard, which means gold will be locked in. But you got to get from here to there. So right now, when we're not on a gold standard and policymakers don't know what they're doing, great time to buy gold.
Jim, you said you have yet to meet a hedge fund billionaire, and you've met many.
Correct.
Who does not have a personal allocation of physical gold. They are ready for what's coming. Their clients are not. What does that statement mean?
Well, it means exactly what it says. I'm not going to mention names, but I lived 35 years in Darien, Connecticut, which is the next town over from Greenwich, and I worked for hedge funds, worked for billionaire hedge fund managers. A number of them are my friends, so it's a world I'm familiar with. Whether in New York or Greenwich, Connecticut, or Darien for that matter, or even around the world. And so these are individuals who are famous for their stock trading, bond trading, foreign exchange trading, arbitrage, quantitative trading. There are many different, global macro, there are many different strategies, and they involve securities, stocks, bonds, derivatives, commodities, foreign exchange, et cetera. And that's what they're famous for. But the interesting question is, and some of them have very good performance and very long track records, but the interesting question is, what do you do with your own money? Now, some of it's invested in their funds, and some of it's doing the strategies I just described. But these are conversations you'll have over cocktails or dinner or whatever. And invariably, I say, "Do you have gold?" And they say, "Yes." And where you store it, I'll leave that out. But my point being, they have physical bullion. They have it in safe locations. They don't put it in banks. They either use private non-bank vaults or other security arrangements, and they don't talk about it. So again, I'm not going to mention names, but I've had this conversation many times, and they all have physical gold. But then the next question is, well, do the clients? And by and large, no. I mean, I've had many conversations going back, over 10 years, going back to the early 2000s, where I'll talk to people the way I'm talking to you and the viewers right now, and you'll make a case for gold, and they'll listen to you, and they'll go, "Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can see the problems you're pointing to. I can see the difficulties coming. I'm going to go out tomorrow and get some gold." And then you see them a year later or 6 months later, and you say, "Hey, did you ever buy that gold?" And they go, "No, I was busy, whatever." So it's people don't know how to buy gold. They don't know where to store it. They're unfamiliar with it. Nobody's the other gold dealers out there, but you never hear mainstream economists or Wall Street analysts talking about gold, because they want you to buy stocks and bonds, because that's how they make money. It's not necessarily how you make money, but it is how they make money. So so it's a tough, I'm not a salesman. People say to me, "Oh, Jim, you always talk about gold because you make money selling gold." No, not true. Not a dealer. I have gold for personal investment purposes, but I'm not a dealer. I don't sell it. If you buy gold or not, it's all the same to me. I'll give you my analysis and my thoughts, but I don't make any commissions on it. So it's just not true that I have a financial interest in promoting it. I don't. I do promote my books because they don't sell themselves. So yeah, I'll talk about the books all day, and hope the readers listeners do buy Aftermath and read it, because there's a lot in there along the lines we're talking about. But if you buy gold or not, it's up to you. It's your decision. I don't get any commission out of it, but I do. People say, "Jim, if you have gold, doesn't it make you nervous?" They say, "No, the only thing that would make me nervous would be if I were 100% in stocks. That would scare me to death, and I couldn't sleep at night." But I don't recommend 100% gold. I recommend 10% gold, big slug of cash, maybe 30%, because it reduces volatility, gives you a lot of optionality in a collapse. If you have gold, if you have cash, gold will preserve wealth, but cash, you can be the one going out and picking up bargains. This is what Warren Buffett does. And there's room for stocks and bonds in the portfolio. Bonds have performed very well lately, and there's room for stocks. But when I see people with 401ks 100% in the stock market, I just say, this is an accident waiting to happen.
Okay, so that's all part of the barbell model, which you'll have to read in the book. But Jim Rickards, can you let our listeners know how can they get a copy of your latest book, Aftermath?
Sure. The official publication date is July 23rd. So it's coming up very soon. That's when it'll be on the shelves in the bookstore. But right now, you can pre-order it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Pals, their independent bookstore services online, or you can just walk into your local bookstore and pick up a copy. So it's widely available, but you can pre-order it now. We're moving up to the rankings, which is amazing, because we haven't even hit the publication date yet. It's not officially for sale. You can pre-order it, but we're coming up to number one in a number of categories that Amazon tracks: money investing, wealth management, etc. And as we get closer to the publication date, we're hoping for even better results. So yeah, it's available online now, and please have a look, and I hope you enjoyed the book.
I know I enjoyed it. But got to ask, what are you working on next? Any projects that you're going to start on now that the book is done? Are you taking a break?
Yeah. You never get much of a break. Right now, this minute, I'm doing what we're doing, which is this is the beginning of the book tour. Book tours these days. The old days, authors went from town to town and sat in bookstores and signed books, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But of course, the way we talk about books today is digital. So we do podcasts, interviews, video interviews, cable TV interviews, live appearances. So I'm really in the thick of that right now. I'm happy we were able to to schedule this interview to kick it off. This is actually the first interview of the book tour, so that's fun. But I'll be doing some live appearances in Vancouver. We will tour a little bit. We'll be overseas mainly. We'll be in London, Berlin, Vienna, Sydney, Australia, Melbourne, Australia in the coming months. But right now we're focused in the USA and doing, as I say, a lot of interviews. So very excited about it.
Well, Jim Rickards, we're happy you took some time to spend with us. And also in the book, there are some investment secrets that I found pretty interesting also. So I do hope people will go out and get it. But again, we do thank you for your time, and we wish you all the best with your latest book, Aftermath.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Hope to get you on again sometime, and take care.
Okay, we'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
That was James Rickards, author of Aftermath, sharing with us about the coming economic crisis and its aftermath. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the SBTV channel to be updated on new content, and do also check out the SBTV podcast on iTunes and Spotify.